The obstruction of targeted communities, including the function of the patriarchy's race, which was obstructed for the purposes of genocide, which was collectively agreed to in secret, which is the same mechanism that created the Holocaust, which unironically was also specifically designed to obstruct David the king from being able to manifest his contract schedule, which they asserted was going to be the savior of Europe, at which point David, as the savior of Europe, would stop the Nazi coup from the United States, stealing American military equipment using unitary executive theory in order to violate the American treaty, which the Confederates are not loyal to invade Israel, and use the war on terror policies in order to hunt the Jews around the world. At which point, David being obstructed was essential for that plan to be successful, making J. Sekulow's war um, responsible for accessory before the fact for the next Holocaust. At which point, the Haman policy is basically just they had to find some makeup and lipstick to put on the big fat pig that is the natural repercussions of what they're demanding to exist by voter fraud, which is the assertion that they do not, as American civilians, have a right to their rights, and thus they do not have a right to their body, and thus they do not have a right to self determination, such as the mechanism of their ability to control whether or not they have sex, such as, but is not limited to, unitary executive theory used by the sheriffs being able to compel minors to have sex with them after they've been captured or rescued, at which point you have an active pedophile network amongst other black market operations which are actively transmuted, such as an extension of the Contra program, which generates the position of their targeting of David as general of the intelligence oversight, making David capable of arresting them for their violations and thus their engagement of sedition to have arrested David at birth for the legend of David before he was born, blocking and obstructing the essential pieces of information from being able to manifest in order to protect themselves from being arrested by law enforcement in favor of their compromised Confederate cops. At which point you have a series of obstructions in the market manifesting the communism of the white supremacists, which has actively subverted targeted communities such as Lindsey Graham's position of their ability to engage in war without cause against targeted peoples, groups, identities, races, ages, and etc. At which point the justification of the historic obstruction of the targeted communities, such as the black community, would then at that point, under the Confederate policy, be legalized under the custom without reason, under the fraudulent disqualified mechanism of the anti-constitutional system of the Confederacy. These obstructions would be essential to protecting the magic system of the Confederate wizards from law enforcement, at which point you have a system of these perpetual contracted KKK contracts for the wizard terrorist surveillance mechanisms reproducing historic evils, at which point those historic evils, having to have been told the necessary qualifiers to their security, requires them to engage in the full due diligences of what their community would have been doing without the obstruction, which does not apply to many of the white communities, such as, but is not limited to, the white community that was provided land in the Great Expansion West by whatever I believe it was called Manifest Destiny, and then white people were given specific clearances for exponential amounts of profits while everyone else was held back, which is wizard communism. Now, the function of the farmlands was then subsidized for the white farmers and other specific, what do you call it? Affirmative action or white supremacist communism, at which point you have the systems of specifically accelerating the particular groups by the centrally planned economy in favor of picking winners and losers, and thus the position of the market has actively been robbed and exchanged under the precedents as an extension of their celebration of the crescendo concerning their abuses historically of separate but equal, qualifying the position of the general argument of equal, as in the same price, as in the same exact investment that happened for one is mimicked for the other concerning the thing, at which point the delayed realization collaborates with, but is not limited to, the original abuses, and thus the original abuses having to have included those same offers equally were obstructed, and thus the other tamperings against their market have to be collectively analyzed, including the position of the daily aiding and abetting of the felony suppression or conspiracy against rights, at which point you have the manufacture obstruction by the communism, deriving a specific fraudulent series of markets and social engineering, creating an alternative reality where they, being held in a simulation, do not get to act under the personhood, as that would require them to be acknowledged as persons with rights. And in this endeavor to figure out persons with rights, they have historically been sabotaged, requiring the full due diligence of the research of historic to modern to current to the present day contracts which are being obstructed, such as David acquiring the stopping of the crash of '08 from the original estimate, which would have led to his brokerage from the Legend of David company, which would have generated 800 billion, which would have been projected and proven in the trade history, which would have generated his ability to acquire the loan, which would have acquired his ability to have purchased the credit that he would have been able to find from that system, buying the debts owed to them into the Confederate State, which would allow him to manufacture the compelled services of those who have debts to society loyal to the white supremacists to pay off those liabilities, at which point David requires the services to exist in order to substantively manufacture the exchanges, which includes but is not limited to his political party, which was asserted to have 800 billion by the time he was 8, in order to acquire a convention of states which would have subsequently changed the Constitution and generically understood laws in order to conform with these historic remedies, which are being obstructed and defamed by this simulation, where their primary purpose of Sokolo's war is the criminalizing of evidence, such as, but is not limited to, their abuses against those targeted communities, as this is a war meant for KKK terrorist violence, and that violence is specifically designed to collapse the various peoples and communities into compliance as slaves without rights that they could not be able to function under, as they are prisoners of war to be trafficked as chattel. Now, these trades that David would have had requires David to buy the debts off of those communities, which requires them to have a mechanism for him to get paid, at which point the Fed making a deal with David to save the banks from the crash of '08 would have had the contingency of them buying the debts that David would be buying off of those communities, which requires them to have purchased them from debts into the material businesses of the Confederate State, specifically designed for the economic security, including the rest of the remedy, as to absorb the majority or all of the injury in question, allowing for the functional service in order to manifest the purpose of the trade, and thus it self realizes based upon a reflection of itself. Uh, that engagement, Don Senior Bowles, was designed to get the quantitative easing contract, which in the estimate which they targeted David from, they assumed that David did not need Don Senior Bowles or Jackie to take care of him at any point, as he would have been born with all of his resources, at which point he only needs his own faculties from his title to have taken care of everything that he needed. At which point the compromise of any overlapping interest is not significant, as David's dealings with Don Senior Bowles is purely disconnected into a business relationship and not specific to the function of their relationship as blood or relations or other things that might have compromised them into some corrupting position. At which point, Don Senior Bowles receiving those positions would have the School of Hard Knocks, which the wizard communists obstructed, including Lindsey Graham's position of creating a policy to block it ex post facto, so that even if the Americans did take over, the policy would stop them from being able to manifest it, as the agreement by the white supremacists is that they would not give credibility to the School of Hard Knocks, which is a criminal engagement, as the terrorism and Bill of Attainder and ex post facto are but a few examples of the criminality of that strategy in specific. At which point, the position of the School of Hard Knocks, having already existed in the original estimate, had to, by definition, already exist. The obstructed economy had to have already formed it before Don Sr. was born, at which point the function of the black community engaging in its security protocols that it anticipated for David, such as the necessary precautions in order to protect themselves from the white nationalist lynch mobs, such as spending all of their money inside the network that does not gloat or show off outside of the network, which would lead to lynch mobs, requires them to make higher value investments into things such as their education, at which point the function of uppity black men would systematically create a problem for many of the lynch mobs, which has by definition happened in history. At that point, the black woman would have to be the primary function of the benefactor of that investment, at which point they would have the highly accelerated investment, meaning by definition the insurance market would mostly be managed by them after they acquire their PhDs or highest engagement of education in order to competently manufacture this, systematically creating the policies which are essential to the forming of that community's economy, which is the pretext which qualifies the business specifically in the Confederate State, which they would be building for the various arrangements, at which point the obstructed economy would have to have manifested those realities, as the takings clause requires fair payment for anything taken, at which point their full due diligences concerning what those businesses are would be the thing purchased in the taking of the debt. So if David buys the debt and then he forms the businesses that was obstructed from them, then they can manifest the realization of the obstructed value, allowing their generations to eventually catch up to what they're owed, allowing for the status quo function of the highest grade investment, as the market merely requires the confidence which they would have, as all of the base material components would have already been stabilized under that function. Now, this requires the acknowledgement of the various abuses outside of the direct terrorism itself, which is outside of the communism. The terrorism which enforces the communism by the white supremacists has to be calculated in the various offenses of not protecting those who are contracted to be protected, which generates an aiding and abetting affiliation to all of the effects, as their witting non-compliance with the protections promised manufactures a criminal intent each and every day and each and every offense, at which point you have the materialization of these historic offenses. So the fact that they in the past are not alive today would not necessarily be a problem for the manifest solution, which requires all of those debts to be held in trust. That trust actively connected to the Legend of David brokerage, facilitates the non-taxable debts owed registered by the paper trading of the obstructed markets for capitalism, which is the proof of the simulation communism. Now, these debts held in trust not being taxable as they are non-realized gains, manufacture the full due diligences of the paper trades essential for David to know what he's buying in all of the exchanges and which things to prioritize on the basis of it being owed to them and their categorizing of all of them as it specifically reflects their place in the market and thus the manufacture of the preferred remedy as once the investment starts the 800 billion put into that trust begins immediately trading many of the others, which allows for the fair takings clause to be realized from David as intelligence oversight general to have conducted the takings clause and the fair payment for the takings clause through that manufactured system held in trust from the Confederate State, manufacturing the full remedy as a collective community, which specifically being designed for the development of the prioritizing of the reconstruction of what they are owed according to themselves, by themselves, and for themselves, allows them to trade under David's brokerage, under their accounts, manufacturing the restoration of the personhood in its due time according to the collective efforts of David and Don Sr. from David's wealth and Don Sr.'s quantitative easing contract. This, of course, would also include their estimate concerning David's remedy in the World War II problem with the Japanese, as David's Special Operations Intelligence Oversight would have actively rescued many of the women and children from Japan, actively using them as a mechanism of propaganda. At which point, the assumption that in order for them to conduct necessary force in order to win, they would have to beat the market with the contracts of superior value, at which point David would have had to have been invested into for the long-standing period of time, such as, but is not limited to, using the women and children Japanese for the propaganda in Hollywood, hyper-accelerating their ability to be seen by the Japanese by the easily dispersible records, which would facilitate the propaganda mechanism of being able to affect the war in a less violent manner, would have to normalize the popularity of those actors who, becoming famous and powerful for their influence in the progress of the United States interest in that war, would be able to be promoted based upon reciprocal nature, as is demonstrated by the Japanese, who are the targets of the propaganda in that specific reference, which historically would lead to David being given the entirety of Hollywood in order to have made that trade, at which point you understand that his network's interests are actively reinforced by the propaganda machine of Hollywood, including his National News Corporation, including the political social media, which the other social media companies uh, cooperating in the Twitter files actively targeted for dismantlement by the white supremacist communism under the assertion that their plan under the Twitter files cannot succeed because David's non-cooperation as the superiors to the FBI and CIA and military means that he doesn't have to cooperate, and if there is no cooperation by David, then there is no mass censorship, as there is always a mechanism in order to have the proper information, which is protected under the freedom of speech and the freedom of the distribution of information under the fairness doctrine and others, which means by definition their contracts with the Twitter files would have actively lost them their customers once they realized there was something amiss, at which point David, who was already highly successful and understood in the general public as a collective network, would have had the exponential rush of customers seeking to have their services um, provided to them based upon these artificial needs. So, if you understand all of this, then the FBI's historic contracts with the KKK uh, have formed the normalization of their Nazi union of white supremacist terrorist campaigns, as their active collaboration and overlapping function is an acknowledgement of their core based loyalties or their higher loyalties. Whenever they break the law, they do so for white supremacy, at which point the function of their Confederate loyalties facilitates their clear conscience in the breaking of law in favor of the arbitrary loyalty to magic, which has historically functioned um, on the various secret societies, which facilitates their ability to infect without acknowledgement, as they aren't supposed to be a thing that exists, and thus their ability to keep themselves secret then leads to them to acquiring the positions of power, which leads to the function of corruption and protecting themselves, and thus it leads to the criminalizing of evidence, such as, but it's not limited to, J. Sekulow Civil War for the Confederate overthrow of the United States constitutional republic by the non-service of law operations for the functional terrorism, which engages in their attacks on persons, papers, and effects, affecting life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and every other right acknowledged in the record in order to engage the extraordinary coercions historically acknowledged and non acknowledged, such as, but is not limited to, the war on David that founded those policies and were specifically the aim of those policies. The only reason that they exist was to acquire the war on David, is to overthrow the aristocracy of the Americans, as national security, according to their estimate, acquires the high priority targets of those essential to the American safety, from the intelligence oversight, being able to engage in law enforcement against the infection. David's ability to arrest them makes him a problem, and thus you have the function of the insurrection, at which point their ability to destroy the United States has historically been a big fat stupid pig, and that big fat stupid pig needed some big fat stupid lipstick. And that big fat stupid lipstick covered for the cult functions of the KKK inside the government, such as the Children of God program for their various child abuse systems and pedophile rings, such as their war on David's abuse against David from infancy as the child sacrifice system so that he can be replaced by the Manchurian Candidate and Monarch program, which facilitates his ability to be overpowered for the function of turning him into the Antichrist so that they can restore his title all at once underneath one of their controls while nerve hacking him, which facilitates their ability to have overpowered the savior of Europe into the Antichrist, the son of perdition, the man of mystery, the fraud of masters. At which point, the engagement of their terrorist operations requires everyone's collective cooperation around the world concerning the world leaders who have known about this historically and have actively aided and abetted the breach of the treaty to defend the United States against this malicious terrorist campaign, which will lead to the wars which will destroy their countries in David's absence. So the answer is, by definition, according to the record, that the United Nations and America's treaty holding nations are actively, willingly compliant with the criminal operations, which will include the child sex trafficking around the world, in order to validate the Confederates' black market, in order to replace the power of the purse as funding for their various operations, which includes, but is not limited to, the Middle Eastern poppy sales for the use of cocaine and other illicit drugs, which is specifically prohibited. Now, the function of its being prohibited requires the ability to pay for the arrests and abuses and harassments in the subjugations of those who participate in the market, increasing the risk, which increases the price, which sets the market price, which can actively be extorted by those who will not be arrested for as exchanges, which is a permanent money laundering racket which facilitates the mechanisms of their black market dark money income. Now, the function includes their estimate against their various abuses in the creating of the cartels, so those who engage in the higher malicious abuses against people assert their higher statuses, and thus those who are of higher status conduct higher offenses, and thus, as long as you can pay for it, then no one cares, and as long as you aren't paying for it, then you are asserting that you aren't participating, and thus you aren't uh, complicit, and thus you are to be suspected, and thus the function requires the perpetuation of the permanent black market by virtue of the existence of the artificial solutions which are specifically designed to not succeed, such as in the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion, which was taken by the CIA, compromised by the Confederacy, and actively used as other mechanisms are used around the world in order to distribute these types of functions for the social engineering and manipulation of creating crimes that sound too ridiculous in order to exist, so that even if the people hear it, that it's not taken seriously and thus does not have a remedy to a secret. At which point the understanding of this superimposes itself into the original market price, which would actively have been acknowledged in the record, which includes David's School of Hard Knocks campus in Malibu, which includes the function of the trade on the brokerage with his mom, who would have traded him to be able to actively have connections with uh, Calvary Chapel in the area, at which point David would actively be accelerating through the function of the religious relationships in that exchange until he would be able to start his own church, taking that foundation under the contract schedule allows him to acquire his own certification for becoming a pastor under the School of Hard Knocks, forming his own series of churches, which being sister churches with the Calvary Chapel, would actively be collaborating with them in mutual efforts as they would settle on the expansions of their various interests according to the whatever they would trade under the brokerage, um, depending upon whatever the exchange is, asserting David's position as a pastor early in his life, manufactures his place um, under the various churches which would be developed um, specifically and maliciously targeted and abused for the purposes of capturing him and getting the permission from many of the religious groups to have the violation of rights in religion, as the terrorists only need the precedent in reserve. And the churches knowing about the violation, not opposing the violation, would have given permission on precedent for that specific injury, which they, in other cases, in a non racist arrangement, have historically complained about having been violated. And thus, you have the system of the two-tiered system, which generates the precedence of their permissions to the violations as the function of if it's illegal to do it to anyone, then it's illegal to do it to everyone. And thus, if it's legal to do anyone, then it's legal to do to everyone. And thus, the function of them complaining about it under the two-tier system is the infection corrupting the system so that it can be used against everyone else. Now, this includes David's active trades, which would have included his control over the entertainment systems, which would have hyper-accelerated his engagement and development of his various arts, such as stand-up comedy, preaching, music, etc., and thus the multiplicity of David's musical talents in their estimate would have been excessive, and thus every time they would have represented David, they would have tried to have humiliated him concerning his primary objective values from the legal character, creating a defamation simulation. And thus, anything that they thought he was better than them at, asserting his position under the meritocracy as the patriarchy, would actively be targeted for degrading and humiliation, and thus he is only to be insulted under the communist simulation for the things that he is best at, reinforcing the replacement system under the white supremacist communism. Many of the has-beens from high school historically have been acknowledged in the record and would have been pointed to in David's education as people who are incapable of sustaining themselves so long as they have fundamental changes in the basic scenery, at which point the schedule for David's exercises and others, such as his training, would have to be disconnected from these functions, at which point the long-term engagement means that his schedule for these trainings and exercises would have to acknowledge his eventual aging, and thus his ability to sustain himself under those schedules under the various stages of emergency would be the thing determining how the subject would go, including but not limited to the function of the heavy investment into becoming an expert into a particular instrument, which would only have to be maintained probably about once a week. Um, After mastery, there's only the active plateau of sustaining it, which would facilitate his ability to do writing on the side in order to sell to musicians and other talented artists, which manufactures its own series of side gigs and agreements. Now, a primary problem with the function of aging is the function of not having enough flexibility as you get old and cranky and decrepit and everything gets stiff and tough, which requires the functional normalization of yoga as a fundamental foundation. At which point, the assumption is that David would have spent most of his Saturdays conducting a specific focus on yoga itself, as the function would have to permanently sustain his flexibility, um, which is essential to good living. Under that realization of the permanent exercise, it being normalized no matter what he's doing on the schedule, being able to be reproducible, facilitates the sustained quality, and thus there is no relapse as there is no substantive changes in order to trigger a relapse. This, of course, is founded on a basic outline of a very light aspect of, well, actually, it's not light at all, but the basic outline of the abuses of the KKK contracts arranged, at which points the historic purpose of the KKK is the overthrowing of the Republican states. Um, Now, the constitutional republic is the functional thing that they are trying to destroy, as the Confederates are not Americans, and thus their reintegration is not the disillusionment, and thus they required David's contracts in order to exist, in order to have dissolved and normalized into the civilian population, which they did not, as their ability to sustain their identity facilitates their ability to form their terrorist organizations for the purpose of overthrowing the government. And with the dismantlement of the constitutional republic, there are no ones to enforce the law, and thus the Constitution is vulnerable, and thus everyone can ignore it.